Good evening and welcome to the LaSalle Public Library's virtual programming. This is Donna Blomquist. Hi again. Tonight we have a wonderful program for you. Author Renee Rosen is with us to talk about her most recent novel, Social Graces. Before we get to that, and before I switch over to Renee, I just wanted to remind you, as always, a little housekeeping, some upcoming programs. Natalie Martin, Master Gardener, will be back with us on July 20th. 6 p.m. Tuesday, once again, to do just desserts. Natalie's cooking and gardening program put together the delicious things you can make in desserts from your own garden. So that'll be July 20th, 6 p.m. with Natalie. Also, the bread monk, Father Dominic, will be back on Saturday, July 24th at 1 o'clock. Just in case you have been eating all too healthy out of your garden, it's time to have some county fair food. And the bread monk will be showing us some delicious recipes. If you saw the screen now, you can see elephant ears and funnel cakes, just what we all need to go with our salads. So the bread monk will be here on Saturday, the 24th at 1 o'clock. Mark your calendar for that one. And one that we do not have up yet is the life and times of the world's first female paleontologist, Mary Anning. Mary was born in 1799, and Claire Evans will be back to talk about everything UK. Mary Anning was from the UK, and Clara's program is on August 3rd at 6 o'clock. So please mark the calendar for that, and we will be having a flyer up shortly. So to not delay this program any longer, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to turn this over to USA Today bestselling author, Renee Rosen. This is her 7th novel, Social Graces, about the Gilded Age in America. And also she will be sharing with us some details of her past books, her upcoming novel that is going to be out in 2023. And I have to tell you, as I told Renee earlier, I truly enjoyed Social Graces, and I hope you will too. And with that, I am going to shut off my microphone and welcome Renee. Hi, Renee.
Hi. It's so nice to be here with everybody. I wish we could do this in person. It's just not the same, but I am very grateful for the technology that it allows us to all connect, even if it's in the virtual space. So I did prepare a little presentation for you, and keep your fingers crossed that the technology all holds together. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. Let's see here. And hopefully everybody's seeing the book cover of the Social Graces. As Donna said, this is my 7th novel, and this was a really difficult novel for me to write. It actually took me 3 tries, start to top. Just had to rewrite beginning, middle, and end. And all that extra hard work did pay off, because much to my surprise and delight, this book hit the USA Today bestseller list, and it was my first book that ever has done that. So now let's get into a little bit of the story. What is the Social Graces? The Social Graces is the story of these 2 women, Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt, vying for control of New York society during the Gilded Age. And it's also about ladies behaving badly. Now, in some ways, these women were very different, and in some ways, they were very similar. We'll look at Caroline Astor first. She was older than Alva. She's about 20 years older. She was the reigning queen of New York society for 3 decades. She had 4 daughters, and she had a son eventually. So as soon as she produced a male heir, her husband sort of took off, and he sort of spent his time on his yacht, or he spent his time drinking or with harlots, or all of the above. And Caroline was actually more powerful than her husband, which was very unusual for the time. And then we have Alva Vanderbilt, who was her rival. Alva was younger. She grew up in Mobile, Alabama, and she came from a very prominent family. And her mother had great hopes that Alva was going to really take her place in society. She was educated in Europe, in France. And after the Civil War, her mother dies, and her father proceeds to squander the family fortune. And so Alva was actually in pretty dire straits by the time she meets and marries Willie K. Vanderbilt. So now suddenly she has money and she wants into society. And it's not going to be that easy for her, even with her Vanderbilt money. So before we get into that, we have to take a look at why society mattered. Society mattered because it's easy to discount it as just this frivolous preoccupation that these wealthy women had. But, you know, we're talking the 1870s, early 1900s. It's a time when women did not have very many rights. They certainly they couldn't vote. They didn't work outside the home. They didn't, let's say, they didn't have their own money. They were beholden to their husbands and their fathers. But the one thing that they did have was this thing called society. And it was really the reason they got up in the morning. It was in society that a woman of means could exercise some control. If she was throwing a dinner party, she got to plan the menu, the guest list, the decorations, and the entertainment. And, you know, as we're about to see, the entertainments became more and more elaborate. But, you know, the more celebrated the hostess, the more powerful the woman. And there was absolutely no one more powerful than Caroline Astor. When she threw her annual ball each year, if you were not invited, you stayed at home with the lights out. You either left town or you sat in the dark so people would think you were out of town, because it was such a disgrace not to be invited. So, and another thing we have to look at in this world of society is the difference between the Knickerbockers and the Nouveau Riche. Society was broken into two camps. Now, the Knickerbockers were those people whose ancestors had been the original Dutch settlers of New York. They were old money. They were considered American royalty. So Caroline Astor and her sidekick here, Ward McAllister, who we'll talk about in just a minute, they were old money. And they engineered this thing called society because they were very concerned about the nouveau riche, or the new money that was moving into New York. So post-Civil War, you had the industrialists and the robber barons. You had Carnegie, you had Rockefeller, you had the Vanderbilts. And Caroline firmly believed that one's wealth should be inherited, not earned, which I think is a nice gig if you can get it. And she didn't want her four daughters socializing with a bunch of new money. She found them to be tacky and very showy. And, you know, my God, they ate their peas with a fork rather than a fork and knife. So she really wanted nothing to do with them. And Caroline and Ward McAllister went so far as to draw up a list of the 400. There were literally 400 names of people that they deemed were worthy of being in society. Now, ironically, Alva was not on that list. And despite all her money, despite the Vanderbilt family behind her, Caroline would not let her in society. And just to illustrate a little bit further the differences between the Knickerbockers and the Nouveau Riche, here we see Caroline Astor's townhouse. It was right on Fifth Avenue in the 30s. It's where the Empire State Building is right now. Now, you can see it's massive, it's really large, but it's not ornate on the outside. And every other Knickerbocker had a townhouse that was very similar like that. Then about 20 blocks north on Fifth Avenue, Alva comes along and builds what she calls Petit Chateau. And it's based on, you know, a castle that's in France. And it's very, very ornate. It takes her 4 years to build. She worked very closely with the architect. In fact, Alva if she had been a man, she would have been an architect. She certainly had the vision. She spoke the language, and she builds this monstrosity. And nobody in New York had ever seen anything quite like this. And the building didn't stop there. Now we got to talk a little bit about the two seasons in New York society. There was winter and there was Newport. Now Newport was their summer getaway for the upper crust. They went there for roughly 6 to 12 weeks out of the year in the summertime, and they lived in what they called cottages. Now this you see is a picture of Mrs. Astor's cottage in Newport, which she called Beechwood. And it's lovely, and it's certainly large, and you can see her ballroom and all. But take a look at what moves in right next door to her. Alva Vanderbilt, just to get under Caroline's skin, buys the land next to Beechwood, and she proceeds to build Marble House. It's 50 rooms, it's marble. I mean, just take a minute and look at the gilding in her ballroom. Look at her bedroom on the bottom. And you can see that was where her desk was, because most of these women, their offices were in their bedrooms. And just a little bit more about the Newport season is the average woman packed up 90 ball gowns to get through that 6-week period. She changed her gloves on average about 4 or 5 times a day. She changed wardrobes head to toe about 6 times a day. So that was what the Newport season was about. And now we had talked about, Caroline's annual ball, that if you weren't invited, you sat in the dark or you said you were out of town. Well, Alva had never been invited to Caroline Astor's annual ball. So she decided that she was going to get even with Caroline. And when Petite Chateau was finished, she threw an enormous housewarming party, the likes that had never been, nobody had ever entertained on this scale before. And she had 1,500 guests. She spent $11,000 on the flowers alone, 65,000 on champagne. The whole thing cost it was the equivalent of $6 million in today's money to throw this party. And what's more, she made it a masquerade party. And just to sort of drive the knife in a little bit further, she invited everyone but Caroline Astor and Caroline's daughter. Now, in society, they had this protocol that unless a lady called on you, paid you a social call, you were not to interact with them. So because Caroline Astor had never paid a social call or never received Alva felt that she could not invite Caroline's daughter. Now, this was sort of a marriage mart. So Caroline's daughter was devastated. And Alva, I think, very cleverly made Caroline Astor come to Alva's, she paid her a social call, and Alva finally granted her and her daughter an invite. So Caroline Astor actually escorted her youngest daughter to Alva's masquerade ball. And I just want to take a moment to talk about some of the costumes that were there. So you see Alva, she's got these doves that were, floating about. Her sister-in-law actually came as a light. She had diamonds all throughout her dress, and she had a torch, and the torch actually illuminated via a switch that was in her pocket. Somebody else came as a hornet, and there were jewels encrusted in the headdress. Even the men got very wrapped up in the costumes. But my favorite costume of all was a socialite named Kate Strong. Her nickname was Puss because she loved all things feline. She loved cats so much that she came with a taxidermied cat on her head, and various tails sewn into her dress. So I think she wins the prize for the best costume of the night. So, and Alva's ball had been such a success that it kicked off a whole new era of really crazy themed balls. And suddenly these hostesses were thinking, well, I got to do something on the same scale as Alva Vanderbilt. So somebody threw a hat ball. And, people were coming with the most elaborate hats that they could find. The women's feathers were getting caught in the chandeliers and all that. And then somebody threw the Blanc ball, where everybody had to wear head to toe white. If a gentleman showed up with a black jacket or any touches of color, they were turned away. And then the same thing happened with the Rouge ball. And then there was a royal blue ball. And then they sort of had run out of colors. And then someone got the idea that, well, let's do animals. So they started to bring animals in to their entertainments. And somebody actually had an elephant traipsing through their Manhattan apartment, their mansion. One of my favorite balls and one of my favorite scenes in the book is Mamie Fish throws a ball for a very mysterious Prince del Dorego of Corsica. And nobody's heard of this prince, but they're all very excited to go and meet him. And Prince Dorego turns out to be a chimpanzee in a little tuxedo. And he was quite bored with the upper crust and started throwing light bulbs around and making a mess of the dinner table. And then there came the dog ball. And this was where everyone on the guest list brought a dog with them. And the dogs had $15,000 collars that would be worth about $350,000 today. Some of them had hats and bow ties. And while the humans sat at one table, the dogs all sat at another table. They had their own 3-course meal. One of the dogs overindulged on mutton or something, and he just sort of passed out under the table. But the dog ball was a huge success. And then someone threw the horse ball. And you can see this photo here where they took over Sherry's restaurant. Sherry's was one of the finest restaurants in New York. And they brought the horses in on an elevator. They put down dirt and hay. Each guest got a horse. They got a saddlebag with a bottle of champagne and a tube so they could drink the champagne. And they ate on horseback and everything. I have no idea what they did with the manure, but I imagine it was quite a mess, and they never threw another horse ball again. Then the pendulum sort of swings the other way, and you get a couple that decides that they're going to throw a servant's ball. So all their guests go to their dressmakers and say, I need a costume. I need to look like a maid. And they all took this so seriously that people were acting like they were the maids when they went to this ball. They were scrubbing the floor. These were people that had never stepped foot inside their own kitchens. They attempted to make dinner. It was reported that somebody scrambled eggs and somebody boiled lobsters. When it came time for dinner, they sat on wooden crates rather than a dining room table. And instead of napkins, they used newspapers. The men carried brooms as walking sticks. The women carried pails as their handbags. And, I'm sure that their regular staff was left to clean up the mess, just like the horse ball with the manure. So a little tone deaf on that. And then we have sort of the granddaddy of them all, and this is the Bradley Martin Ball. Now, the Bradley Martin Ball was held at the Waldorf Astoria, and the book goes into how the Waldorf Hotel became the Waldorf Astoria. It was a family feud, and at the time of the Bradley Martin Ball, the two hotels were not joined. So this was held at the Waldorf. and they brought in all kinds of elaborate decorations. This ball in today's money cost $10 million. Each guest had their own footman and 3 bottles of champagne. The party favors were bracelets and jewelry for the women, and the men got cigars with $100 bills wrapped around them. Now, at this time that this was going on, the rest of the country was in the middle of a real financial panic, and people were protesting outside the Waldorf because they just felt that the Bradley Martin, this was just such gluttony. And, who could eat, 9 courses of food? And when other people, couldn't even feed themselves. The average person spent $20,000 or $30,000 on their costumes that they were never going to wear again. And this sort of it certainly did not sit well with the public or the press. And Bradley Martin and his wife were so vilified for having this party, this ball, that they were run out of New York. And I don't think they ever returned. And this was sort of the last of the grand balls. After that, people sort of woke up and said, okay, we have the haves and the have-nots, and we need to put our money to better use than just amusing ourselves. But when the upper crust and the smart set were not attending balls, they were behaving badly, very badly. And there were lots of scandals that went viral, Gilded Age style. So you have to understand that prior to 1880, there were no gossip columns. There were no society news papers. Occasionally they would cover or just make an announcement of a very prominent wedding or a birth. But it was nothing like what happened after 1880. There was a newspaper called Town Topic, which sort of started things off. And what would happen was that many of the valets and the ladies' maids would be only too happy to talk to the press about who was getting into the brandy before noon and whose husband was canoodling with a harlot on Murray Hill. And so a lot of stuff started to leak out to the press, and it really shaped the way society sort of conducted themselves. They were very aware of the press. Some people knew how to use the press better than others. Caroline Astor did not talk to the press at all. I think she gave 2 interviews her entire life, and they were very brief. Alva used them as a marketing strategy. When she threw her masquerade ball, for example, she invited the press in ahead of time for a guided tour of Petit Chateau to ensure that she was going to get a lot of coverage for this ball. And you can see here that there was a lot of divorce. There were duels. I don't want to give too much away for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, but one very prominent society lady was having an affair, and her very salacious love letters were published in the press. So it was, it really changed things. And this is the closest they were going to get to social media, was having all their comings and goings reported. And the person who was really the first, quote, media whore was Ward McAllister. Ward McAllister just loved to talk to the press anytime, anywhere. And here are some of his famous quotes. A dinner invitation once accepted is a sacred obligation. If you die before your executor must attend. A man with $1 million can be as happy nowadays as though he were rich. He was so pompous. Society, as I found it, was a book that he wrote where he really threw everybody under the bus. It was just a tell-all. though he didn't name names, everybody knew when he was talking about Caroline Astor. Everyone knew when he was talking about Alva Vanderbilt, and he sort of gave away everybody's, secrets. And he would, call out a hostess who had not sufficiently frappéd her wine. And he was an odd little duck. And after writing Society as I Found It, Society turned its back on him. And Caroline would have nothing to do with him. And he did himself in. And he ended up dying alone in one of his gentlemen's clubs, where he was just eating by himself because nobody wanted to be with him. So I am having just I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen, I think. Sorry for this. I hope you guys can see this. Okay, I'm gonna do a little workaround here. This is where it's hard not to be able to hear you guys. Okay,
It looks fine. It looks
okay,
fine, Renee. Mhm.
okay, great. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about we're missing a slide here that was about Newport, because I did a lot of research for this book at Newport. And Newport, as we said, was their summer getaway. And all these cottages, these 50 and 75 room cottages, are right along the Atlantic Ocean. And they're just butted right up against the sea. And there's this very beautiful walkway that you can take. It's called Cliff Walk. And when we went there, I was so enamored of the homes, and I wanted to see the back of Marble House and the back of Beechwood and all. And I'm not paying any attention to the signs, which are, you pass at your own risk on the walk, which is public right of way, private property, in spots just a couple feet from the path, or abrupt drops over 70 feet. And I paid no attention to this. I was not wearing sensible shoes. We were walking and we came to like this first, where the pathway ends, and you're basically just facing a lot of rocks on top of rocks. And you have to basically scale these cliffs to get to the other side. And John basically carried me over that. And he said, we got to turn back. And I said, oh God, no, I can't make it back over that again. And I thought that was the end of it. But no, that was a cakewalk compared to what lay ahead. And, we were at the point of no return. We were losing cell power, losing daylight. A bathroom would have been really nice. And I decided that if I ever survived this cliff walk, I was going to use this in the book. So there is a scene in the book where one of the characters gets stranded on Cliff Walk. And when you come to that section in the book, you will know that it came out of my own research. And if you do go to Newport, definitely go on Cliff Walk, definitely wear sensible shoes, and pay attention to the signs, and don't go past where the caution signs are. And so before we get into some Q&A, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about, we talked about the social graces, but I want to give you some background on some of the other books that I wrote. As Donna mentioned, I've written 7 novels. My first one is called Every Crooked Pot. It came out in 2007. It took me 17 years to write before I found a publisher. And it's a semi-autobiographical coming of age story. And I was born with a hemangioma, which is a strawberry birthmark over one of my eyes. And I had a larger than life father. And he wanted to find a doctor who could fix me cosmetically. And I had to find a way to fix myself internally. So that's basically the story. It was a love letter to my father and a way to preserve what it was like growing up Rosen style, because my father was an outrageous character. I couldn't have made him up. And then I could not find a publisher for my second book, which was Dollface, which took me 10 years to write. And I finally found a home with the publisher that I've been with all this time, which is Berkeley, part of Penguin Random House. And my mother said to me, you know, if you want to make a living at this, you're really going to have to pick up the pace. And I did. After Dollface, which is the story of a flapper who falls in love with two mobsters from rival gangs during Prohibition Chicago, my publisher said, give us another Chicago historical novel. And I was thinking, well, what's more historical in Chicago? What's more Chicago than Marshall Field? But I didn't know if there was a story there beyond a rags to riches story. So I started doing some research, and I discovered that he had a 30-year love affair with his neighbor who was 20 years his junior. They were both married to other people. And I thought, that is so juicy. I can write this. So that became What the Lady Wants. And it starts with the Great Chicago Fire, and it goes through the Haymarket riots and how he built Marshall Field's store, all the way up to the Columbian Exposition. And you get a sense of just what a vision he had, as well as the love story, the love of his life. And then my editor said, give us another Chicago book. So I was really intrigued by the Chicago Tribune and all, and I wrote White Collar Girl. And this is a story of a young journalist in the 1950s who gets a job working at the Chicago Tribune. But because it's the 50s, because she's a female, she gets relegated to covering society news, much like what we just talked about in the Gilded Age, weddings, balls, things like that. But she wants to be a serious journalist, and she discovers a secret source inside the Daily Machine, and she starts scooping all the guys at the Tribune. And all I will say is that I knew Chicago was corrupt, but I did not know that it was that corrupt. All the scandals in White Collar Girl came straight out of the headlines. I didn't have to make up a thing. And it was a real eye-opener about how the machine worked. When Kennedy and Nixon were debating here in Chicago, everything that went into that, Daley's hand in the election, it was a real eye-opener. And then what do you think happened after White Collar Girl? My editor said, give me another Chicago book. And I was frankly running out of topics. And we had a conversation, you know, like could be baseball. And I said, well, I'd rather stick needles in my eyes than write about baseball. And she said, well, what about the blues? And I didn't know anything about the blues. I knew Bonnie Raitt. I knew Eric Clapton. I didn't really know the blues. And I started doing research, and it was very apparent right away that there was a story with Chess Records. Chess Records was a record label started by two Polish Jewish immigrants who knew nothing about music. They knew nothing about recording. They didn't play an instrument. They didn't sing. They didn't read music, but they formed this record label that went on to introduce not only Chicago, but the rest of the world to Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, Etta James, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley. It goes on and on and on. In fact, the Rolling Stones recorded with Chess Records, and they named themselves the Rolling Stones as a tribute. It's a Muddy Waters song because they loved the blues. They didn't really have a vision of being a rock and roll band. They just wanted to introduce people to the blues. And so that became sort of the core of Windy City Blues, but it's also an interracial love story that is wrapped around the birth of the Chicago blues and the birth of the civil rights movement. It's a book that is very near and dear to my heart. And prior to writing The Social Graces, it was the hardest book that I had to write. Then it was time for me to metaphorically get out of Chicago. And I had been binge watching Mad Men, and I really wanted to set a novel in New York during that time period. And so I wrote Park Avenue Summer, which is really Mad Men meets The Devil Wears Prada. And it's the story of a young girl who moves from her small Midwestern town to New York and lands a job working for Helen Gurley Brown when she first took over Cosmopolitan magazine. And I had more fun with that book. Helen Gurley Brown was a real trailblazer. She was such a character. I had always thought that she started Cosmopolitan magazine. I didn't realize it had been around since the 1800s. It was once a literary magazine, if you can imagine that. And she single-handedly changed the face of women's magazines. She took that job on with no editorial experience, no magazine experience, and she just she really left her mark on that. So we talked about the social graces, and I will give you just a little bit about my next book, which Donna mentions coming out in 2023. It doesn't have a title yet, but it is about Estee Lauder. And Estee Lauder was an amazing and complicated woman. The book starts in 1938, which is right around the time when she started making her lotions and potions out of her kitchen in her Upper West Side apartment. And then she would take them to all the beauty parlors on the Upper West Side and try and sell them. And she invented the whole gift with purchase idea. And again, I don't want to give too much away, but there was a lot of controversy and some things that didn't quite square in her childhood and in her upbringing. So that I'm just in the middle of edits with that, and it will be out in spring of 2023. And I apologize for the glitch in the slides, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Nothing's off the table. Donna, if you have any questions, go right ahead.
I can start us out while our audience is putting their questions in the chat. Sisterhood was a topic that was covered quite a bit in this book, and I felt that aside from it just being a reality, it was something that you felt was impressive and important to those families, the connection between the girls. And I wonder how that, well, you tell me about it. I just wonder if it related in the same way that society related to women as a whole, that this is what they had to fall back on.
Are you talking about literal sisterhood, or are you talking about the camaraderie between the women?
No, I'm
both?
talking about literal sisterhood, the
Literal-
girls.
So, I think that the sisters, Alva, Alva had a very interesting and tumultuous relationship with her sisters. And I think that it was her sisters and her own struggles that shaped her later, sort of leaving society behind and becoming a suffragette. Caroline's daughters, those sisters, I think they each represented a different avenue that a young woman could take. They, I think that Emily and Helen were, those were the two oldest girls. And I think that they were probably very protective of each other, but, whereas Emily followed her heart, she wanted to marry a man that her mother did not approve of. Helen was much more of a pleaser, and she sort of followed suit and followed in her mother's footsteps. And she married a guy named Rosie Roosevelt. And yes, he was related to Franklin Delano. He was second cousin, I bet, first or second cousin. But, she did everything the right way. And then you had Charlotte Astor, who was a real rebel. And I think she influenced Carrie, the younger sister. But I looked at those sisters as I think that, particularly the Astor sisters, it was hard to be an Astor girl. There was a lot of focus put on them, and it was there were a lot of expectations. Now, Consuelo, who was Alva's daughter, she was the only girl. So, the sisterhood doesn't really apply to her, but, you know, the theme of sisterhood and mothers and daughters is definitely woven throughout the book. And that was something that I hadn't even realized until, I got 3/4 of the way done. I was like, oh, because I don't outline. So I never know where I'm going.
Thank you. It's interesting you bring up a process here, and I have more to talk about suffrage, but one of our audience members, Christy, our director, said, thank you for talking about your other books and your process. What do you do when you get writer's block?
Interesting. So I have written all my life from the time I was a little girl, and I've never not written. And we just moved and renovated our other place. So I had just turned in the Estee Lauder book. So this is the first time that I haven't written every day in a long time. And I'm a little rusty. And I thought, oh my God, am I getting writer's block? I've never had it before. Am I getting it? And my process is to keep the story alive in my head. That even if I'm not writing, I'm percolating on it. And I was so focused on packing up and moving and renovating that I wasn't thinking about my story anymore. So I had to get myself reacquainted with it. But in terms of my actual, I write every day when I'm not moving and renovating. And usually I write in the morning that's when I'm most productive. And I do not outline. My life would be a lot easier, and my editor's life would be easier if I could do that. But I have learned the hard way to take my hands off the wheel and just let the characters lead the way. If you have a real character and you know a lot about them, you use that as your guidepost. If you have a character that's fictional, or a character like Caroline Astor, where there wasn't a lot written about her and she was so private, then you got to really think long and hard, what makes this person tick? And once you get that, then I let the characters go. And I'm constantly surprised. I don't know how a story is going to end. I don't know how a chapter is going to end. I feel like I'm kind of channeling the characters and the storyline. I'm just like waiting for what's going to come my way.
Hey, we have another question from Stephen. Can you please talk about the research you do for historical pieces and your process for organizing your research notes?
Okay. So just on a real basic thing, I work in a software program called Scrivener. And Stephen, if you're doing historical fiction, I highly recommend it as a software program. It allows you to keep all your research organized, filed, links. You can make notes to yourself, but it's not an intuitive program. So you have to watch a tutorial, but Scrivener is key. I will never work on another book without Scrivener. And how I start off is I'll always start off with reading. That's my foundation, because I tend to take on topics that I don't know anything about. And I start reading, and I'll read biographies, autobiographies, memoir, any kind of nonfiction that I can get my hands on. And I try and lay the foundation. And then I get incredibly lucky. Like, for example, when I was writing Park Avenue Summer, I was introduced to a woman who regarded Helen Gurley Brown as her second mother. And she vetted the book. She showed me letters from Helen Gurley Brown. She gave me stories I wasn't going to find in any other source material. The same thing happened with White Collar Girl. I was introduced to a woman who had started as a copy boy in the 1930s at the Tribune. And she told me all these great stories. She showed me how the city room worked. She vetted the book. She told me, she's like, kid, you're watching too much Hollywood, too much TV. It wasn't like that. And she actually became the inspiration for two of the characters in White Collar Girl. Her name is Marion Priscelli. She's amazing. And the same thing happened with Windy City Blues. I was introduced to members of the Chess family who introduced me, who again gave me stories that would not have been anywhere else. I met Willie Dixon's grandson and his daughter, and to this day, we're very good friends with members of the Chess family. And they, like when Chuck Berry was recording with them, he would stay at their house. And he and Terry, he shared a room with Terry Chess. Terry had one of Chuck Berry's guitars. So I get so crazy lucky when it comes to research. And I'm so grateful because then I end up becoming friends with these people. And to have their blessing and their endorsement and stamp of approval on a subject that they know so well means the world to me. So, I go and I see it, touch it, feel it. I drove the blues highway. I went to juke joints. I tried to learn to play blues guitar. I'm terrible. We went to Newport. So if there's anything to be seen, I will go to museums. I will go and travel to those places. But it always starts with reading, and then I get lucky along the way.
That is a marvelous story in and of itself. And a presentation in and of itself. I have a question about, of course, whenever we have a history program, or I consider this a history program because there's so much research behind it. The characters are always shaped by their times. And I know you started moving into talking about Alva's interest in the suffrage movement. Can you talk a little more about that? Because I think it's really, really important, a pivot in her life that really, I think, was for the better.
Absolutely. Alva spent years clawing her way up to, the top of society. When she finally got there, I think she took a look around and said, this is all there is. And because she had grown up privileged and then lost it, and she knew what it was like to struggle. She, and again, I don't want to give too much away in the book, but if you know the history of Alva Vanderbilt, it's no secret, she divorced her husband, and that just was not done there. So she saw how difficult that was for her being a woman of means. And if she, being a Vanderbilt, couldn't divorce her husband, then how was an ordinary woman going to do that? So she was a trailblazer, and she was all about equal rights. And she became after she divorced Willie Kay and married his best friend, but that's another story. She became very involved in the suffrage movement. And she actually donated Marble House for various fundraising events where they would sell a ticket for $1. You could walk through the lawn, the gardens and all, and listen to the speeches. For $5, you got to go inside Marble House, and you would be able to view various rooms. So she was very instrumental in that. So was her daughter, Consuelo. But she really, I think she felt like an underdog. So she was really going to be an advocate for people that she felt were not getting a fair share, a fair shake.
I think that's such a marvelous change in her history. Somebody asked, is this Newport in Rhode Island?
Yes, okay. It is.
Yeah, I had another question. I just slipped my mind about I know, suffrage. Yeah, even at Marble House, I think it was at Marble House, Alva was good about this not just being a white women's movement. She included African Americans and people of color in the suffrage movement in the North. However, as a girl of the South, when she supported Southern causes, she respected the Southern tradition of exclusion of African Americans. Did you have any research on that?
My research didn't really focus on that. I was focusing more on the earlier years, but so I don't know that I can speak that knowledgeably about that, but I know that that she was very concerned. You know, it wasn't about color. It wasn't about this. She wanted women and people who were not fairly represented to have a voice and have opportunities.
Well, it was a marvelous change for her.
Yeah.
Let's get a little bit frivolous here just for a minute, because we'll probably be closing out with this. But Ward McAllister, what a guy! And I wonder if I think Carolyn, who was so private, as you pointed out, and spoke little to the press, may have spoken more to the press, but through the Ward mouthpiece. He seemed to be a spokesperson for her. And I just wonder what kind of relationship they had. It seemed almost very close, almost very close.
Yeah, it's funny that if it had been any other two people that were not married that were out together, the rumors would have just been flying. But no one ever suspected, or I think because it was society, they were running it like a business. And, he was a confidant up to a point, because I don't think Caroline really confided too much in anyone. But he was just such an odd duck. His wife, he did not have a lot of money of his own. He married a wealthy woman. He was actually kind of a failed lawyer prior to that, but he was so enamored of society. And he had gone to Europe, and he came back thinking that he knew all about the proper way to entertain. And, he was the self-proclaimed tastemaker, and he was such a snob. And, he adored Caroline. I think he worshiped her. I think she thought he was a little bit she used him. She knew she needed him. But he loved the spotlight. I'm telling you, he was the original media whore. He loved the attention. And, there's been speculations, was he a homosexual? But he was married, although, in that time period, that wasn't unusual. Other than in his memoir, which is, you really can't even read it. I tried reading it, and it is just atrocious. It's so poorly written, I can't even believe it got published. But aside from that, he was all about appearances and etiquette and the way things should be done, and men's fashions and women's fashions. And he was a really interesting character. And I'm telling you, between him and Mamie Fish, and so I could not have dreamed up these characters.
Linda says, thank you for this extremely interesting presentation. Talk about designing women. Power is seductive. And that is so true in this case. Well, I think that I don't see any more questions, Renee. So I am going to ask you one last thing. Have you always been a Chicagoan?
No, I grew up in Ohio.
Oh,
I grew up in Ohio. Then I went to school on the East Coast, lived in New York for about a year, and then moved back. And I got homesick and I came back, and I've been here ever since.
Well, that's great. And hopefully at some point when our library opens up to in-person programming, you'll be able to come and visit us for another program.
I would love that.
A preview of your 2023 book. I'm hoping that we open before it's published, but we'll see.
Hopefully.
But in any case, this has been a delight. As I said, I truly enjoyed the books. I love that spoon-fed history. I'm a nonfiction reader by nature, but I love these because I love the historic detail. This is just wonderful. I now have opened the audio for Windy City Blues, and I'll be starting that one tonight.
Oh, and Robin Miles did the narration, and she's amazing. That woman is so talented. She did
Uh,
all the voices, men, women, children. She's amazing.
I can't wait. So just to remind everybody, books come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. We probably have every format, and if we
Yes.
don't, I'm sure the bookstore does.
And Dollface and White Collar Girl are also coming out in audiobook in August. They're
Wonderful.
both being worked on now, actually.
Well, again, thank you. This has been a wonderful program. I'm just delighted with it. And I will welcome our audiences again to tune in for the next one, which is Natalie Martin and the gardening. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you, Renee. And I will turn it back to you, Renee, for closing comments.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you. This has been a dream come true to live my life as a writer and to be able to share my stories. And also, I know that we all have to be read piles up to the sky. We're never going to be able to read all the books that we want to. So it means a great deal to me whenever someone will take time to sit down with one of my books, whether you listen to it, read it as a digital book or physical book. And I sincerely appreciate you give me an opportunity to share my stories with you. So thank you, Donna. Thank you to the library, and everybody stay well.
Thank you, Renee. And with that, I'll say good night.
Good night.